Thank you so much, Oliver, for the introduction. In the interest of time, I'm just going to jump right into it. Okay. So first of all, for those who are interested or curious, who haven't been in this space, I want to talk about, why is so much trust repair research conducted using experiments? There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, are practical considerations, because we can't predict when a trust violation is going to occur to then go jump in and study it. This is the same challenge that scholars face that research leader succession events. You don't know when a leader is going to turn over. You don't know when a CEO is going to leave. And so it can make studying leader succession very challenging. So sometimes people choose to study that in a lab. Secondly, a lot of the research questions that we ask when it comes to trust repair is we're trying to understand. So we have two parties, the trustor and the trustee. The trustee is the person that either violated trust in some way. They're either guilty or maybe just accused. Okay, and so we want to know, how does the trustor kind of think about this violation and react to the repair attempts? What we're trying to do is kind of understand their cognitive processes. So those research questions naturally lend themselves to an experimental methodology, right? Because you have to match the research question with the method being used. And so that's another common reason. You also have to remember that trust violation or repair actually plays out in stages. And again, if we were trying to do this in the field, even if we knew when the violation was going to occur, what is going to be that timing for the verbal response, the apology or denial? They're going to want to exhibit some trustworthy behavior afterwards. How long is that going to go on for? Well, if you take this, you put it in a lab or an experiment, then you can, focus on all of these stages. You can have the violation, you might have an initial sort of repair attempt, like a verbal repair attempt, and then some substantive amends as well. And you can watch this play out, kind of a sequence of events. Okay, so it's nice to be able to do that in the lab. And finally, we're trying to study these things in a field context, study things like apologies and denials, trying to repair relationships. There are so many other factors that could intervene to confound this, right? Organizational context, the history of the parties involved, the quality of their pre-existing relationship, the reputation of the parties involved, industry norms, all kinds of things. And so by studying this, using experimental methodology, we can hold all those other things constant, and that's greatly, increases and speaks to the internal validity of our research. Okay. Now, I conducted a lot of this research with my colleagues, Peter Kim, Kurt Dirks, Don Farron, and along that journey, we had to deal with a lot of challenges from reviewers and AEs. So what were some of those challenges that we had to deal with? Well, there are limitations inherent in the two most common paradigms for studying trust repair. So those would be scenario-based studies and then behavioral games like the trust game that Kevin's going to talk about pretty soon. Okay, so with scenario-based studies, sometimes you can even try to make it rich by using videos and things like that. And so you can make the scenario study very high in mundane realism. In other words, you can create it so that it really does replicate a familiar organizational context, like a hiring context, and that's a good thing. But usually all you have is participants taking the role of a trustor, and they're reacting and reporting their attitudes, but they really don't have a stake in the game. Okay, so the criticism is that it's low in experimental realism. On the other hand, we have the trust game and other similar exercises, which would be very high in experimental realism. You're giving people cash, there's money involved, there's actual stakes, you're looking at actual behaviors. So it's high in experimental realism, but then the critique is, well, it doesn't really look like something that you're doing in organizations. Well, how do you get past that? Well, what we've often done is we've usually paired these two paradigms within the same research study. And I've seen other people do this as well, like Marie Schweitzer and colleagues in the 2006 paper that comes to mind. And what it does is it balances out what people would see as the limitation of the two paradigms. And usually when you do that, you should see these attitudinal measures of trust and the behavioral indicators converge. That's what we found in our own research. That's what I saw Marie Schweitzer, found in his research. Okay. Some people might say, well, are you really studying trust? Because these people didn't know each other. Did trust even exist in this relationship? Well, there's a couple of answers there. First of all, we now know from a lot of theoretical and empirical work on trust that you can have really high levels of trust existing, very early in a relationship, or even with people that you don't know for various reasons. And so that's a good argument. Another thing that you have to consider, though, is that a lot of the relationships in organizations, they are new relationships, or they're very arm's length relationships, which are similar to new relationships because you may not have really any information about the other person. And so if people are saying, well, are you studying something important, even though these are new relationships? The answer is yes, because that does replicate a lot of the relationships that we have in our organizations. Okay. Now, you also have to be very careful to define and talk about what you mean by repair. Like, what does it mean to repair trust? Okay. Usually we just compare the level of trust after the response, the apology or what have you, to post-violation trust. Okay. So after the violation has occurred, there's low trust. And we see if the apology or the denial or what have you increased that trust. We're not necessarily comparing it to pre-violation trust. Now, when we do, what we find is that repaired trust rarely, if ever, at least for us, reach those pre-violation levels. Sometimes that's called pristine trust. Okay, but you have to be careful to define the notion of repair. And finally, the trust repair process, as I mentioned, there's the trustor, and there's the trustee. The trustee is the violator or the person who's accused. And when you have these experiments, the trustee is the one who's doing all the acting. They're offering verbal responses, they're offering substantive amends, they're behaving in certain ways to try to repair trust. And the trustor in these experiments is forced to take on a very passive role. And all they're doing is reporting their reactions, their attributions, what have you, to the event. Now, in real life, we know that there's a lot more dynamic interplay between these two folks, right? And the trustor could try to push back to the trustee and say, well, I'm not sure if I believe your apology or what have you. There could be an iterative back and forth. And that is challenging to recreate in a lab. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but there could be some trust repair experiments that maybe, kind of switch the perspectives around to try to look at it from both sides at the very least. Finally, what are some opportunities to further advance thought in this area? There were 4 things that came to mind as I was preparing for this talk. First of all, we know a lot about interpersonal trust repair, but what about trust repair at the organizational level? Nicole Gillespie and Graham Dietz have a great paper on that in AMR. But what we know is that organizational trust repair can be a lot more complex than interpersonal trust repair, because you can have different people within the organization or kind of related to the organization, like the board of directors, acting on behalf of the organization to repair trust. And, people are going to make a judgment about, how credible are those folks to act, to act for the organization. Can they really initiate change within the organization? You also have to consider that organizations have a larger repertoire of things that they can do. I mean, they can dismiss the guilty party, right? You see them firing errant CEOs all the time. And those are responses that aren't available to individuals. Okay. I also think it's interesting to think about what inspires or motivates a trustee to want to try to repair trust. Because you can think of circumstances where if somebody is accused of doing something, okay, they might think, okay, well, I've been accused by so-and-so who I work with for doing this, but gosh, I mean, she accuses everybody of this. She's known to be kind of a complainer, and she kind of goes around and is known for doing this. She has a reputation for doing this. So maybe if I believe that of this other person who accused me, I'm not going to want to even try to repair trust with her, because I know, first of all, kind of what's the point? And secondly, I might even distance myself from that person rather than try to repair trust with that person. Another thing that we're all thinking about these days is how does this new virtual world, affect different dynamics? And I think it's really relevant thinking about trust repair. I think, there's no clear answer. I can see it going a couple of different ways. First, if you're having Zoom meetings, on the one hand, you could feel that because these types of meetings seem a little bit more formal, it could be a little bit more uncomfortable to try to repair trust with somebody and have that difficult discussion and offer an apology or denial in this more formal setting, okay, rather than just maybe kind of walking into somebody's office and doing it. So that could argue against people being likely to try to repair trust in this Zoom world. But on the other hand, there is a certain beauty to being able to hit that end meeting button and you're not going to see the person down the hall again. So in that case, you could think, well, I'm going to give this a shot and try to repair the situation with this person. And if it doesn't work out, the meeting's going to be over and I don't have to see them right down the hall because I'm in the safety of my house and they're many miles away. So then that would say, well, you might have people being more inclined to have these difficult conversations and trying to repair trust in this Zoom world. Now, finally, I've been kind of, keeping up with current events and, you can't help but wonder, do some of these larger societal influences change the nature of trust violations in the workplace? And I really think that they probably do. In my own research, we really only studied violations that were related to the work itself. But let's say, people in the workplace, they begin to discuss social justice issues or something like that. Maybe they don't agree. I think that could easily end up, causing trust violations in the workplace about things that aren't even related to the work itself. Now, let's take this a step further, because we also know that these days, employees and organizations are really not just encouraging, but pressuring their senior leadership, their CEOs, to speak out on political issues. There's a really interesting AMR paper, a new one by Hambrick and Wowak, that discusses this. And, it's easy to think that, okay, well, if you're trying to get your CEO to take a certain position and they don't, their mere silence, their reticence on that point could constitute a trust violation for you. Or if they do speak out and you happen to be somebody in the organization who doesn't agree with that position, again, that's going to constitute a trust violation for you. And so I think, I think that the way that trust is violated within organizations, it might be changing and expanding these days. And finally, I just want to say, for anyone out there who is interested in this area but hasn't jumped in yet, there's a couple of great review articles by Roy Lewicki. One is in Academy of Management Annals, and another one's in Annual Review. So I encourage you to take a look at those if you're interested in the trust repair space. So, thank you, Oliver.